Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. Patrick Utting, another officer from the London Fire Brigade. Yes, Ms. Curtin.
Good morning, sir. May I please call Patrick Utting?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Utting.
Good morning, sir.
I gather you're going to make the affirmation.
Yes, sir.
The words are on the screen. Can I ask you to read them out, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down. Make yourself comfortable there.
Do you might object, sir, if I take my jacket off?
I don't object at all. No,
Thank
of
you.
course. Make yourself comfortable as you like.
Thank you.
Right. Good. When you're ready, Ms. Curtin.
Thank you, sir. Could you please confirm your name for the record?
My name is Patrick William Utting.
Good morning, Mr. Utting. Thank you very much for attending to give evidence today to the inquiry. We're very grateful.
Good morning.
My questions are intended to be short and simple. If you have any difficulty following what I'm asking you, please just ask me to repeat or rephrase the question and I'll do so.
Yep.
If you need a break at any time, please just say.
Yes.
And finally, if you could try to keep your voice up for the transcribers, and also if you could avoid nodding or shaking your head and just say yes or no, just so it's caught by the script, that would be very helpful.
Yes.
Thank you. And you've made 2 Rule 9 witness statements for the purpose of the inquiry's Phase 2 investigations. And the first of those is dated the 20th of July 2020, and this is at LFB 00118-918. Is that it?
That looks very much like it, yes.
And there is a signature on page 22, if we could go to that.
Yes.
That's your signature. And your second statement is dated the 14th of June 2021, and that's at LFB 00121-173.
Yes.
And that's your second statement.
Yes.
And if we could look at the signature on page 4, please.
Yes.
And that's your signature, is it?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And there were a number of documents exhibited to both of those statements, is that right?
I think 80.
Something in that order, yes.
Yes.
And you've read the statements recently, have you?
Yes.
And you've read the exhibited documents recently as well?
Yes.
And could you confirm that the content of the statements is true to the best of your knowledge, please?
Yes.
And you're happy for those statements to stand as your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes.
And have you discussed your evidence with anyone other than your legal team prior to attending today?
No.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin, Mr. Utting, by asking you about the roles that you held at the London Fire Brigade. And you state in the first sentence of paragraph 4 of your first witness statement, the reference for which is LFB 00118-918/1, that you joined the brigade in May 1985, and that was in an operational role, is that correct?
Yes.
And you go on to state in the fourth sentence of that same paragraph that in 2000 you joined the Officer Development Group, which involved training crew managers, is that right?
Yes.
And then following that, in 2006, you moved to the Incident Management Training Team, and your role there involved delivering training and facilitating training exercises and debriefings, is that correct?
Yes.
And is it right that incident management is another term for incident command?
Yes.
So does that mean, to be clear, that your role in the Incident Management Training Team involved delivering incident command training specifically?
Yes, training and assessments and exercises, but yes, training.
Thank you. And you state then, looking at the very top of page 2 of your statement, that in 2009 you moved to the Incident Command Support Team, which later became known as the Incident Management Policy Team. And it's correct there again that the Incident Management Policy Team was the same as Incident Command Policy, is that right?
It's fair to say that you can sometimes use management and command and you mean the same thing.
Yes. So would it be right to say that team was also focused on incident command? Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And that team sat within the Operational Assurance Department, is that right?
It did. There was always some reorganisation of structure.
Yes.
And I don't think Operation Assurance was always there. I think previously it was incident management.
Yes, I see. Thank you. And you go on to say further on in that same paragraph at the top of page 2 of your statement that in 2009, the Incident Management and ORT Operational Assurance Team was created and you became part of that team. Is that right?
Yes.
And is it right that you were a station manager by that time?
March 12, yes, I was promoted in 2009.
In 2009. And that remained an operational role, is that correct?
Yes.
And again, does the incident management element of that team also refer to incident command?
Yes.
So were you continuing to work on matters relating to incident command? Is that accurate?
Yes.
And if we look at the bottom of the same paragraph, you say that in April 2012, you moved to the Operational Procedures Team Incident Communications section.
2013.
2013, yes. Sorry, yes, I said
That's right,
2012.
yes.
Could you explain for the panel very briefly what that role involved, please?
In incident communications.
Indeed, yes.
I was the station manager in incident communications. We were responsible for the policies that were associated with that department. We were responsible for breathing apparatus, radio interface equipment. Are you familiar with terms like barrier? Yeah. Would you like me to just come out with the term, right, or do you want me to explain it?
I think you can assume that there's a basic familiarity with,
Okay.
with terms like that. So policy relating to communications issues, would that be a fair summary?
Yes.
Thank you. And you say in the final sentence of that paragraph that you remained in that team until January 2015 when you moved to operational procedures, operational policy.
Yes.
Yes, and it's correct, is it, that that was the department that was responsible for creating and amending operational policy?
Yes.
And you remained in that department for a short period of time before your retirement in April 2015, is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
Would it be a fair summary to say, Mr. Utting, that the roles that you occupied during your time with the LFB had a focus on incident command specifically, or is that not accurate?
Yes, I mean, apart from the 9 years in training where I wasn't operational, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yes, it was 15 years on fire engines, 9 years in training, 6 years as an operational station manager.
Thank you very much. Now, your statements to the inquiry address two separate matters. First, your involvement in the development of Policy 790, which was the Brigade's policy on fire survival guidance course, is that right?
Yes.
And secondly, your involvement in the review and amendment of Policy 633, which was the policy on operational high-rise firefighting, is that right?
Yes.
And I'm going to ask you, first of all, just so you know, about your involvement in the review and amendment of Policy 633, which follows on from the evidence that the inquiry's been hearing from Peter Cowap over the last 3 days. And I'll then move on to your involvement in the creation of Policy 790. So if we begin with Policy 633 and your initial instructions, and the inquiry's heard the evidence from Peter Cowap that you were asked to take the lead on reviewing and amending Policy 633 to ensure that it fully reflected the new version of the National Guidance on High-Rise Firefighting, GRA 3.2, which was under review in 2013, and then the final version published in 2014. And you produced an email that you say is likely to mark the beginning of your involvement in the review of 633. And that email is at LFB 001189339. If we could look at that, please. Thank you.
Sorry, did you say it was published in 2014?
The GRA 3.2, the
Beg your
final
pardon, not
version.
62. Yeah, absolutely, February.
And 633 was published in June 2015, is that
Yes.
right? Yes, thank you. So if we could have a quick look at this email, and this is dated, you'll see at the very top, the 2nd of April 2013. And you'll see that that's an email from Jim Acourt to you on that date with the subject line, Lacanal verdicts. And Mr. Acourt says, Pat, I've had a quick word with Peter Cowart with reference to the high-rise GRA and the LFB policy. It's something that we will lead on for ops procedures, and Peter is likely to talk to you next week on your return from leave about it. Could you do some preliminary work on this and involve Dave too, as he's carried out much of the assessment in terms of policy gaps based on national GRAs? Is it right that at this time, so April 2013, you had just joined the operational procedures team? Is that correct?
I'd moved from incident management into incident communications.
Thank you. And we know that you had obviously had some considerable operational experience by this time. Would you say that you had any particular operational experience of high-rise firefighting specifically?
Well, my time on fire engines, if you like, my education would have been at Old Kent Road. So we were fighting fires on the Aylesbury estate, the Haygate estate, the North Peckham estate, and around New Cross. So you're talking late 80s into the early 90s.
Yes.
And I would say we were busy with high-rise incidents. Following that, all I'd say is that I spent 9 years in training, so I wasn't hands-on, as it were, but we were trying to educate firefighters to become crew commanders or crew managers,
yes,
or whatever period, to try and give them some of the skills to be able to perform their duties on the incident ground.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And we can see in that email that Mr. Acourt directed you to work with someone called Dave. Do you remember who that was?
I'm taking it, and that's David Eagling.
I see. And did you, in fact, work with Dave Eagling on the review of 633?
I don't recall Dave's I don't recall a huge involvement that David had.
I see. Thank you. And then if we could look at another document, please. This one is at LFB 000086676. And this is a meeting request. And you can see that the subject here is given as Lacanal verdicts. That's at the very top. And the date is stated as the 10th of April 2013. And the required attendees are Peter Cowart, Jim Acourt, Lee Drawbridge, Phil Morton, and you. And the organiser just above that is given as Jim Acourt. And just below the list of required attendees, we can see the text, to discuss Lacanal outcomes with reference to high-rise GRA and LFB policy. Do you have any recollection of attending that meeting?
No.
No. Do you know if you were given instructions at any other time, in that case, about your review of policy 633 and what you were being asked to do specifically?
No.
No. Do you recall Peter Cowart having any conversation with you?
Oh, I must have had conversations with Peter.
Yes.
Yes.
And in his evidence to the inquiry, Mr. Cowart said that he recalled telling you something along the lines that the review of policy 633 was likely to be a relatively straightforward task. Does that ring a bell?
I think cut and paste rings a bell. Yes.
Yes. Of the GRA 3.2.
Of using the GRA to review 633.
And we can see in another document, and this one is at LFB 00107-005. Thank you. And this is Philip Morton to you on the 10th of April 2013 with the subject high-rise GRA Lacanal version 5th of April 2013, I think that probably is. And we can see at the bottom of that thread that Philip Morton is sending Peter Cowap. He says, please find attached the latest version of the high-rise GRA with the amendments that you requested. So it appears that you were being forwarded the latest version of the draft GRA on the 10th of April 2013, so around the beginning of your involvement in the review of Policy 633. And do you recall having any discussion with Peter Cowap or indeed Jim Acourt about the draft GRA 3.2 at around the time that you started work on Policy 633?
I can't remember, no.
No. Do you remember being told anything about what changes were being made to the draft GRA 3.2 at around that time?
No, but they will have been plain when I looked at the GRA, because I would imagine they would have been in track changes.
And is it the case that you were being copied in on emails that concerned draft versions of the GRA 3.2, and that's how you were being kept in the loop?
No, I think this is the first time I saw the GRA. Unless this is after the times that I went with Phil to read through it with Peter, but I think the occasion I'm thinking of is the final version.
I see. Thank you. That's helpful, and we'll probably come on to that shortly. You've stated in your witness statement, and I don't need to take you to it unless you would like to go there. The reference for the transcript is LFB 0018918/16, and it's paragraph 62. And you say there that you were not responsible for reviewing Policy 633 in light of the Lakanal House inquests. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And we've seen that Lakanal was referred to in both the meeting request that we looked at a moment ago and in Mr. Acourt's email to you of the 2nd of April 2013. Perhaps if we look back at those very quickly.
Yes.
If we go first to Mr. Acourt's email, which is at LFB 00118-939. Thank you. And if we could look now at the very bottom of the thread, so the final email, which is from the bottom of page 1, going on to page 2, and it looks like what was being forwarded to you was an email from Leah Clements, and you can see in the body of that email, if we go over to page 2, thank you, she set out a link which appears to be to the Lakanal verdicts and Rule 43 letters, she says so far, Rule 43 letters being the name that is given to the recommendations that are made by coroners arising out of evidence heard at inquests. Do you recall when you received that email, if you accessed that link? Do you remember looking? It was no.
I've got no recollection of that link at all.
I see. And if we could look again briefly to the meeting request of the 10th of April 2013, and that's at LFB 000-86676. Thank you. And as we've seen, if we just look at the content of that meeting request, which states to discuss Lakanal outcomes with reference to high-rise GRA and LFB policy. And that suggests that there was a meeting at which the Lakanal inquest and specifically the recommendations made by the coroner took place. Do you have any recollection of any such meeting or indeed any such discussions with anyone with whom you were working on the draft Policy 633?
No. Sorry. No.
Thank you. Can you recall if you were aware that one of the main reasons that the draft GRA 3.2 was under review and was being amended was because of recommendations made by the coroner following the Lakanal inquests?
Yes.
Yes. And I'd like to look briefly, please, at the coroner's recommendations that were directed to the LFB, and those are set out in a letter that can be found at LFB 000 32158. And we can see that this is dated the 28th of March 2013. Is that letter familiar to you?
No.
You don't think that you saw it at the time that you were working on draft policy 633?
No.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to look at a couple of specific points in this letter, but mindful of the evidence that you've given that it's not something that's familiar to you, but I'd just like to ask you some general questions and see how we go. And we can see, just to orientate you, that at the very top of page 1, the letter is marked as coming from Her Honour Francis Kirkham, Deputy Assistant Coroner, and it's addressed, you can see at the top of the left-hand side, to Ron Dobson at the LFB. And could we now look at the top of page 3 of the letter, please? And this sets out the recommendations that the coroner made in relation to incident command specifically. And from the top line of page 3, we can see that the letter states, "It is also recommended that consideration be given to training of ICs," that's incident commanders, "and potential ICs to enhance their performance in relation to the following." And it then goes on to state, if we can look at the third bullet point, to anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. Do you remember if there was any discussion in general terms with you when you were asked to start work on your draft policy 633 about that recommendation? So in general terms, if not in relation to the Lakanal coroner's recommendation specifically?
No.
And I'm also going to ask you to look, please, at the Rule 43 letter, so the same type of recommendations that was sent by the coroner to the Department for Communities and Local Government. And this is at HOM 000 0018. Is that letter familiar to you at all?
No.
Do you recall whether you were aware that recommendations had been made by the Lakanal coroner to the Department for Communities and Local Government at the time that you were working on policy 633?
Not to CLG, no.
I see. Again, I'm mindful of your evidence that you're not familiar with this letter, but I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions about it and see how much you can assist the panel. Could I ask you to look at the coroner's recommendations in relation to GRA 3.2 specifically, and those appear in the second paragraph of the second page of the letter, please. And there it's stated, "It is recommended that consideration be given to review of generic risk assessment 3.2 high-rise firefighting to provide consolidated national guidance as to the following." And if we read from the second bullet point, awareness that fire can spread downwards and laterally in a building, awareness of the risk of spread of fire above and adjacent to a fire flat, awareness that insecure compartmentation can permit transfer of smoke and fire between a flat or masonette and common parts of high-rise residential buildings, which has the potential to put at risk the lives of residents or others. Would you agree in general terms that any recommendations for matters that needed to be considered in relation to the new GRA 3.2 were also relevant to the LFB's review of its own policy 633?
Yes.
And would you agree that one of the key features of the Lakanal House fire was the unexpected early compartmentation failure?
I suppose my difficulty with that is that I'm not familiar with the outcomes of the Lakanal fire,
I see.
despite having been there.
I see. So would you say that you had any broad knowledge at the time that you were working on the draft policy 633 of what had actually happened at Lakanal?
Not specifically.
No. Would it be... I'm going to set out a brief summary of what the inquiry understands happened at the Lakanal House fire, and please tell me if there's anything that you disagree with, or indeed it may be just that it's outside of your knowledge. Would it be correct to say that the Lakanal House fire started in a flat on the 9th floor of the building, but then spread quickly to floors both above and below the fire flat where the fire originated?
That's familiar, yes.
That's familiar. And would you say that that was something that was familiar to you at the time that you were working on Policy 633?
Yes.
Yes. And in relation to the smoke spread that occurred at the Lakanal House fire, would you agree that there was significant smoke spread into common areas, both the corridors and the stairwell at the Lakanal House fire? Yes.
Yes.
Is that... Sorry, I'm saying yes because you look like you were about to nod.
Yes.
And would you say that that's something that was familiar to you at the time that you were working on Policy 633?
Yes.
Would you say when you started work on draft Policy 633 that you had those specific features of the Lakanal House fire in your mind, or was that something that you were not particularly focused on?
No, they were definitely on my mind, yes.
And do you remember discussing those particular features of the Lakanal House fire with anyone in relation to your review of Policy 633?
Not specifically Lakanal, no.
Do you remember discussing with anyone in relation to your review of Policy 633 the need to be able to prepare incident commanders to be able to respond to an incident involving rapid failure of compartmentation?
Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
Of course.
Please.
Do you recall having any discussion with anyone when you were working on the draft 633 about the need to prepare incident commanders to be able to respond to an incident that involved rapid failure of compartmentation?
It's the rapid that's throwing me.
I see.
I'm with you all the way in the fire spreading from a compartment.
Yes.
It's the word rapid that I'm less familiar with.
Understood. So if we rephrase it, perhaps, do you remember discussing with anyone when you were working on the draft Policy 633 the need to prepare incident commanders to be able to respond to an incident involving failure of compartmentation?
Yes.
Yes. And there was another feature of the Lakanal House fire that I'd like to ask you about, if I may, and that was the presence of panels on the exterior of the building which had in part facilitated the fire spread and which were eventually found not to be compliant with building regulations. Again, was that a feature of the Lakanal House fire that was familiar to you when you were working on your review of 633?
I was familiar that there was an issue with panels because I can remember standing there looking at it. My understanding and impression of it was that part of the reason that the panels had failed was because of the length of time that the fire had been burning in the building.
I see. Thank you. I wonder if we could look back to your witness statement briefly, please, at paragraph 86, and the reference is LFB 00118-918/20, please. And you say there that you were not party to any discussions or information sharing regarding the risk of facade fires in high-rise buildings. had the risks of facade fires or cladding as a significant fire hazard been identified, this would have been considered in the review of PN 633 and would have impacted significantly on the risk assessment. So just to be clear, does that mean that there was no discussion that you took part in with anyone as part of your review of Policy 633 about fire spread over facade panels at the Lakanal House fire, or indeed generally?
There was no discussion.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to the next subtopic of your review of Policy 633, which is your gap analysis. And you explain in your witness statement, perhaps if we have that on the screen, it's paragraph 55 on page 14. Thank you. And you say there that you were supervised in your work on the policy by Jim Acourt, DAC Kevin Hughes, and AC Peter Cowap. And would it be correct to say that it was Mr. Acourt who was your immediate supervisor in relation to your review of Policy 633?
Yes.
And would it also be correct to say that Mr. Cowap had less direct involvement?
With 633?
Yes.
Yes.
And how closely did you work with Mr. Acourt on your review of 633?
Closely.
Did he undertake any of the drafting, for example?
I can't remember Jim getting hands-on, as it were, with the drafting. We must have done some of it together.
Okay, thank you. And what about Mr. Hughes?
No, I think Kevin was slightly back from this just because Peter had so much, having spent years on the GRA. I don't think there was any requirement for Kevin's input, which might have been a mistake. I don't know.
And in terms of how you got started, if we could just scroll up slightly, please, in your witness statement, and looking at the beginning of paragraph 54, which is on the same page. Thank you. And you say that you worked with Phil Morton, and you go on to say, slightly further down in the same paragraph, it's about halfway, and the sentence beginning, we undertook.
Yes.
You see that? And you say, we undertook a gap analysis between the risk assessment in section 2 of GRA 3.2 and the version of PN 633 extant at the time of the review. We cross-referenced the GRA 3.2 risk assessment at section 2 with the then current PN 633 to check that every hazard that was in the risk assessment was also in PN 633, where we identified hazards and therefore risks and control measures that were not in PN 633. We added these to the draft that we were working on. And I think when you refer to we in that passage that we've just looked at, you're referring to you and Philip Morton, is that right?
Yes.
And you've helpfully provided a copy of that gap analysis as an exhibit to your witness statement. And I'd like to ask you to look at that for us, please. And that's at LFB 00121-174. If we could have that on the screen, please. Thank you. That's your gap analysis, is it?
I think that is part of the gap analysis. I have a strong recollection of a spreadsheet and this prose, I would say. It looked more like, I'm sure you showed one the other day that was done by Kevin Hughes.
Yes.
That sort of format.
I see.
And this was where Phil came in really handy because he was much better at that sort of stuff than I was. So I've always been expecting to see that. And if that's the only version you've got, and that was last edited in May, then that's the only version that there is. I'm surprised.
Well, that was, yes, going to be my next question, because you've explained in your second witness statement, which I don't think I need to take you to, but that's what you say in terms of the date that document that we can see here was last edited. You say May 2013.
Yes, there are some comments from me, I think.
I see. So it's from those that you've taken the
I
date?
think so, yes.
Yes. Do you recall working on any type of gap analysis after that date?
I don't recall it, no. However, there are emails somewhere in the system whereby between myself and Phil, where Phil thinks we've been asked by Peter to review a version of 3.2. And Phil is trying to confirm with me whether I think that's what Peter means. Yeah? And I think I go back to Phil saying yes. So that puts it in my head that, and to be fair, this is how we would have worked. If something changed, we would have gone back to what we had done before, tried to identify those changes, and then if they were accepted, if that makes sense, we would have put them in. And that should be, you should be able to follow that trail. If we can't find that trail, then you would have to make the assumption that we didn't do it. I'm surprised that we didn't do it. Phil and I were not in the habit of not doing what our Assistant Commissioner asked us to do. And also, when you're talking about the final version, and then there's a final version, if we'd been asked to look at the final version, this is the one you're talking about that came back.
Just to be clear, you're talking about the final version of the risk assessment or the draft GRA?
Oh, the 3.2, I beg your pardon.
Yes, understood.
Well, if that had come back with changes, if Phil and I had looked at it and identified those changes, unless we've gone, well, they're covered somewhere else, which we would have told Peter.
Yes. Yes, well, that's very helpful, thank you. And I was going to ask you about that period of changes to the draft GRA 3.2, about which we heard from Peter Cowap yesterday and the day before, which you may be aware, it sounds like you may be aware, took place over the period of July to November, broadly speaking, in 2013. So after the date that you've given in your statement as your gap analysis being finalised.
Oh, definitely. So
yes.
What I'm trying to convey to you is that I knew there were different versions because the version was sent, yeah, and it came back, and the impression I got was that Peter was not happy with what he was being presented with. I don't think I saw too much of the detail at that time.
Yes.
And then there will have been a toing and froing at that sort of level. And then I would have thought that if there were substantive changes to it, Phil and I would have done something about it. Understood.
That's very helpful. And we are going to come on to some of the changes that were made, so you will have an opportunity to address the panel on those. But that's very helpful. I'm going to, again, I'll be mindful of the evidence that you've given, that perhaps there were updated versions or indeed other versions of the gap analysis document. But for the moment, this is what we have got to go on.
I absolutely accept that, yes.
So I'll ask you a few questions on this, and by all means, if you think that issues that I'm raising were addressed in different versions of the same document or indeed a different document, please do say. Now, it's right, isn't it, that there was an explicit reference to cladding systems in the version of GRA 3.2 that was published in 2014. Is that something that you're familiar with?
I must have read it.
Yes.
Yes.
And do you think that you were aware that there was also a reference to cladding systems in the draft version of the GRA 3.2 that was in circulation internally within the LFB at the time that you say you were working on this gap analysis in May 2013?
Well, yes.
Yes. I'm just going to ask you to look at that draft version of GRA 3.2 for completeness so we can see, and that's at LFB 000 33971. Thank you. And so you're aware this is the draft version of GRA 3.2 that was circulated internally by Peter Cowap on the 1st of February 2013, so indeed not long before you were asked to start working on your review of Policy 633 in April 2013.
Yes.
And if we could look at page 11, please. And the last substantive paragraph there, you'll see, starts with the words, it's a line rather than a paragraph. Information to be gathered in relation to high-rise incidents should include. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we go over to the following page, please. And there, the second bullet point reads, building construction features such as the presence and location of masonette-style construction, sandwich panels, timber framing, cladding systems. And do you recall whether, when you compiled the gap analysis, you took a conscious decision not to include the reference to cladding that is there? And the reason I ask that is because there is no explicit reference to cladding in the version of the gap analysis that we've just been looking at.
Yes.
So do you think that that was a conscious decision not to refer to cladding, or is that more likely to have been an oversight?
I think when you look at the 633, it's light on building construction, and I can think of UPVC windows, and timber frame buildings will have been in there, but that was Pete's. That was definitely going to be in there. Apart from that, it was quite light, and I think one of the decisions that we made, I think either consciously or subconsciously, was this policy was not about trying to describe all the different building construction features of all the high-rise buildings in London. I mean, look out the window. If we'd put all that information in detail, no one would have read it.
Thank you. Mr. Utting, I'm now going to move on to the next subtopic of your review of Policy 633, and this is the initial consultation process, please. And I'm going to ask you some questions about the process that was followed within the LFB in those early stages of reviewing the policy. And if we could look, please, to your witness statement again, at paragraph 65. So the reference is LFB 00118918/17. And looking at paragraph 65, please. And you explain there that you wrote to Jim Acourt on the 5th of June 2013, informing him that you were content with the draft of PN 633 to be sent out for peer review, and you then say that you can't recall whether this in fact took place. And just to be clear, peer review is one of the initial stages of policy consultation that is gone through at the LFB when creating or amending operational policy. Is that right?
Yes.
And Mr. Cowap's evidence to the inquiry yesterday was that the reason that he took the view that at the time that it was not necessary to carry out a peer review at that stage in the process was because of the work that had been carried out in relation to the review of Policy 633 in 2011. And you had not had any involvement in that much earlier review of Policy 633 in 2011, is that right?
That is right.
And do you remember if you had a particular view either way when you sent your email to Jim Acourt on the 5th of June 2013 as to whether the draft 633 that you had been working on would in fact benefit from going through a process of peer review, or do you think you didn't have a view either way?
I wouldn't have sent it to him if I hadn't wanted it to go out for peer review.
So to be clear, you did think that it would benefit from going through peer review?
Yes, and look at the flow chart. The flow chart is there for a purpose, so you don't forget things.
Yes.
And also, because I'm not just thinking about that point there, when you get to BJCHSW,
yes,
if it was me, I would say there was a potential risk if you haven't followed the process.
Yes.
That they might, if they wanted to, I'm not suggesting that they would go, you haven't followed the process properly.
I see. And could you assist the panel, as maybe a very obvious point to you, but what are the specific benefits of going through peer review when developing or amending operational policy?
Well, it would have gone to fire. It would have gone to potentially Steve Dewdney. You would have a group of your normal peers, as in those people physically sort of sitting around you, but you would also have your little list of, how can I put it, reliable people who would give you feedback. Because I'll be very honest, sometimes you didn't get the feedback you would have expected to have got.
But it sounds like the feedback was often useful. Would that be right?
I did not know everything about high-rise firefighting. It made no sense not to do it. Especially when you think of it, okay, what would it have been? 3 weeks?
Thank you. Now, the next stage of consultation was the heads of service review. Have I got that right?
Yes.
And you refer to this at paragraph 66 in your witness statement, so just the next paragraph down from the one we were looking at a moment ago. And you state there that the draft policy was sent for heads of service review by David Eagling on the 1st of July 2013. And let's look at David Eagling's cover email, which is at LFB 000-29155, please. Thank you. And he states, "Dear all, please find attached operational procedure PN633 high-rise firefighting for heads of service consultation. Please be advised that this revised policy has been aligned with a new national high-rise generic risk assessment, which has been written by LFB and which is due to be published by CLG shortly. The final draft of the GRA is attached. Both the GRA and this revised PN incorporate lessons learned from both the Shirley Towers and Lacanau incidents, and this has led to additional material being incorporated within the revised procedure to cover scenarios and issues that the UK Fire Service had not previously experienced or planned for." And we have the draft version that David Eagling attached to that email. And I'd like to ask you to look at that, please, because there are a couple of parts of it on which I think you may be able to assist the panel. And that draft is at LFB 000-34166. Thank you. And the first part that I'm going to ask you to look at is the direction given in this draft version of the policy to the need to re-evaluate advice given to callers on fire survival guidance calls. And this is in the section entitled Fire Survival Guidance, which is on page 15, if we could go there, please. And paragraph 7.50. I'll just read that out for the benefit of the transcript. "The advice offered during fire survival calls should be re-evaluated throughout an incident, and this may require a change in the advice given. In exceptional circumstances, an IC may consider informing control that their advice to FSG callers should be altered, e.g. to attempt to leave their property. The IC should remember that this advice may be contrary to national policy for control staff on FSGs, and liaison with the officer in charge at control will be required for agreement to change the prescriptive advice. See policy number 790, fire survival guidance calls, which we're going to come on to later. Would you agree that there is no explicit reference to stay put in that paragraph?
Yes.
And would you also agree, or do you recall, that there was no explicit reference to stay put at all in that draft version of Policy 633 that was circulated for heads of service review?
Without seeing the whole document,
I understand, yes.
If you're telling me that it's not in there, then it's not in there.
Yes, indeed. I appreciate it's difficult to give an answer about something that's not there. But if you do take it from me that there is no explicit reference to stay put there, could you assist the panel with why at this stage in the drafting process, so when the draft policy is being circulated for heads of service review, there wasn't an explicit reference to stay put in there? Do you recall if that was a conscious decision or not?
I don't recall it as a conscious decision. I'm sort of surprised it's not there because, I wrote fire survival guidance calls.
Yes.
So they're my words. And I thought that in there I'd made reference. I might be mistaken, but if it's not there, it's not there.
Thank you. Do you remember whether at this stage in the drafting process you had had any discussion with anyone or any explicit consideration as to the potential need for an incident commander to change stay put advice, i.e. to tell callers in a high-rise building to attempt to leave their property?
Yes, those are my words. They're my words from 790. And
that's an issue about which you'd had explicit consideration at this time in your review of Policy 633. Would that be a correct interpretation of what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is it was always there because I put it in, I negotiated it with control to put it in.
Thank you. Now, the other part of the draft policy that I'd like to ask you to look at, please, is the evacuation section, which is on the same page. It's just slightly further up. And you can see from the subheading evacuation, and again, I'll read it out just for the benefit of the transcript. The IC should follow the evacuation plan devised as part of the occupier's fire risk assessment, unless the fire situation dictates otherwise. Firefighting operations can be adversely affected by the type of evacuation being taken, the progress of the evacuation, and the number and type of people being evacuated. Evacuation can be made more resource intensive if the occupants have an impaired ability to make their own way to safety. For example, disabled persons or those under the effect of alcohol or drugs may need greater assistance. The IC should consider A, the effect of firefighting tactics on evacuation and vice versa, B, where it is safe to do so, using other emergency service personnel to assist with evacuation, and that widespread evacuation may divert crews from the tasks they were briefed to undertake, which may require additional resources, and C, the need to establish, if appropriate, separate attack and evacuation stairwells. And again, there is no reference there to stay put explicitly or to the possibility that the stay put policy may become untenable, is there?
No.
And we know that the potential need to evacuate a building with a stay put strategy was eventually added to the version of Policy 633 that was published in 2015. And I'm going to ask the documents manager, please, if we could keep this version, this draft version of Policy 633 on the screen, please. And if we could have on the other side of the screen the final version of Policy 633 as published in June 2015. which is at LFB 0001256, and the relevant page of that final version is page 14. And that will help us compare the two. So if we look, Mr. Utting, at the version on the right-hand side of the screen, and again, that's the final published version of Policy 633, and we can see that a new paragraph 7.46, has been inserted into the final version, which reads, "It may be necessary to undertake a partial or full evacuation in a residential building where a stay-put policy is normally in place." Do you see that?
Yes.
Yes. And just for completeness, there is also a new, if we look at the little paragraph B in relation to paragraph 7.47, on the right-hand side of the screen, that's a new subparagraph B, which reads, "The resources required to support the evacuation or stay-put policy," and that's listed as one of the items that an incident commander should have under consideration. Do you see that one there as well?
Yes, I mean, the pedant in me would say it's a stay-put principle rather than a policy. That's a mistake.
Thank you. If we can focus on the differences in that final published version, so those two additional passages that we've just looked at, do you recall how those explicit references to stay put came to be added to that final version of Policy 633 before it was published? Is that something that you have any memory of?
No.
We've already referred to the fact that there were discussions between Peter Cowap on behalf of the LFB and the Department for Communities and Local Government in that period, July to November 2013, about stay put and evacuation explicitly, and how those were referred to in the draft GRA 3.2. Do you know if those discussions might be the reason why those explicit references to stay put ended up in the final version of Policy 633?
I do not know that, no.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you now in very broad terms about some of those discussions that took place with DCLG, and I'm mindful of the fact that you weren't party to them. Now, the inquiry heard from Peter Cowap that after DCLG were provided with the draft version of GRA 3.2 for the purpose of publication in July 2013, so this was the first time that the draft GRA went to them, there was then a meeting between Peter Cowap and some officials from DCLG on the 30th of July 2013. And if we could look, please, at LFB 000-84466. And this is an email from Peter Cowap, you see at the very top there, to Les Britzman, and the inquiry understands that Les Britzman was part of the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisors Unit within the department. And you'll see that that email is dated the 31st of July 2013. And if we could just look at the first paragraph, please. Peter Cowap states, "Dear Les, following our meeting yesterday, I would confirm that we will make the amendments discussed and agreed to the evacuation and fire survival guidance calls section of the high-rise GRA on receipt of the information which you're going to provide." And it looks like you were blind copied into that email. If we look at the section that's referred to as tracking, which lists the full recipients of the email, and can you see your name is there, second from the bottom?
Yes.
But it's right, I think, to say that you did not attend the meeting that's being referred to here with Les Britzman.
I did not attend that meeting.
Thank you. Following the meeting, Peter Cowap also emailed you and Philip Morton on the 3rd of August 2013, and I'd like to ask you to look at that email, please. It's at LFB 000-84467. Thank you. And you'll see that the subject line of that email is GRA 3.2 amendments. And Peter Cowart stated, "Dear Phil and Pat, with regard to our recent meeting with CLG and agreed changes to the high-rise GRA, my record of the meeting is that they are confined to the section below and include, number 1, making more explicit the point that the advice given to occupants in residential high-rise buildings to stay put and keep doors and windows closed provided their dwelling is not affected by the fire, heat or smoke may need to change. If fire, heat or smoke is spreading, the IC needs to ensure any worsening situation is accurately reflected in messages to Brigade Control so that appropriate advice can be given to occupants in affected flats and so they can be advised to evacuate if necessary. Number 2, the occupants of high-rise buildings may not always act as firefighters expect or in accordance with the building evacuation plan. The occupants of commercial buildings can be expected to practice fire evacuation, but the same may not be true for those in residential or mixed-use buildings. Some occupants may be unfamiliar with the building and its layout and may be visiting for the first time. The IC needs to factor these considerations into the operational plan and into assessing the resources needed to deal with the incident. Please check the wording of number 1 with Brigade Control for accuracy and to ensure it accords with their understanding of this aspect of fire survival call procedure. I think the remainder of the points made during the meeting are already covered in the extant text, but when you make these changes and respond to whatever Les B sends you, you may need to change the order of the existing text and or amend it slightly to ensure it remains intelligible. Would it be correct to understand, Mr. Utting, that Peter Cowart was sending that email to you in order that you could ensure that any further changes to the draft GRA were carried across into the draft policy 633 that you were working on at that time?
Yes.
And in paragraph 1, his numbered 1 of that email, Peter Cowart refers to the possibility of residents being told that they need to attempt to leave a high-rise building in the event of a fire rather than stay put. And by this time, so the 3rd of August 2013, we know, because we've just seen, that the draft policy 6.3 had already been circulated within the LFB for the heads of service consultation. That was the David Eagling's email that we've just looked at of the 1st of July. And we've already referred to the fact that that draft version of policy 633 that was circulated to heads of service did not contain any explicit references to stay put. And it also contained no reference to the need to evacuate a building with a stay-put strategy or to give any guidance on when and how that should be carried out. Is that consistent with what you remember? This is the draft version that we were looking at a moment ago that went to heads of service, yes. Now, do you recall when you received Peter Cowart's email on the 3rd of August 2013? Well, I should ask you first of all, do you recall receiving this email on the 3rd of August 2013?
I don't recall it, no.
Do you recall in general terms being made aware of the first issue that Peter Cowart is raising in this email, namely the need to address explicitly the point that incident commanders may need to change stay-put advice to residents and tell residents to leave? Do you have any recollection in general terms of discussions with Peter Cowart or indeed anyone else around this time?
No, because I thought it already existed.
I see. So your recollection is that by the time you were circulating the draft 633 to the heads of service for that part of the consultation process, reference to stay put to the extent that stay put needed to be addressed in policy 633 was adequately addressed. Is that a fair summary of your evidence?
I think so, but also, again, my failing is that as soon as you start talking about fire survival guidance and stay put, I go back to 790.
Of course.
I struggle not to. It was a long question. I'm sorry.
Absolutely, yes, understood. And I should say also, I am aware that I'm asking you about events that were quite a number of years ago now, so it's perfectly fine to say that you don't recall. If I could try rephrasing my question in a different way, do you recall ever having any concerns at any point when you were working on the draft version of Policy 633 that the issue of stay put and evacuation was not adequately addressed in the draft version of the policy?
I don't recall that, and again, I can recall there was conflict between the advice that we were giving people to either very sensibly call the fire brigade and leave your property, and the stay put principle. And I can recall definitely going to talk to community fire safety to check what advice they were giving, and coming back with the pamphlets that they were offering. So there was this there was an awareness of the conflict, and there was our underlying reliance on the stay put principle in residential high-rise buildings.
And do you recall when you approached community fire safety what they told you in terms of advice given to residents?
I think it was that advice to stay put was the accepted advice in those types of properties.
I see, thank you. Do you recall whether you gave any thought to whether the draft policy 633 that you were working on needed to address specifically guidance as to when stay put advice should be changed by an incident commander?
Not when, no.
And what about how to go about implementing an evacuation in the event that stay put advice is changed?
When you say how, do you mean giving people a tactical plan of how to evacuate a high-rise residential block of flats?
If indeed that's possible to give such advice, yes.
Well, I would say it is possible to give that advice. I would struggle to give you a plan that would fit every imaginable scenario I can think of in every imaginable building out there. And I would be pretty confident that had I given you that advice, so say for example, we'll go, right, start fire floor above. Reasonable? That might not be the right thing to do.
Thank you. Can I ask you also about the training implications? Do you remember when you were working on the draft 633 whether you gave any consideration to the LFB's existing incident command training and whether that addressed the matter that was set out in the policy 633 provision that we've just looked at about the need to change stay put advice?
No, there wasn't much. Well, I don't think there was. No, well, I don't recall ever delivering any training on evacuation, and bear in mind that's what I used to do. I certainly don't remember ever being sent on the evacuation training course. Yeah. What I do know is that we used to run assessments for station managers up to and including assistant commissioners and operations review teams who had to pass an assessment at the level of assistant commissioner. And I can vividly remember one of the scenarios that we did, and I can vividly remember it because it was precisely about evacuating a high-rise residential block of flats. Simply, and I can remember it because the candidate pretty much early on went, get me 6 fire rescue units. So, and to be fair, that was an assessment. What I would then say is that we were not in the habit, once we got a really good exercise, of throwing that away. So I struggle a little bit personally with some people saying that they didn't know what to do to evacuate a high-rise residential building.
And if we focus on that, what I can call a gap in the existing incident command training in terms of no training on how to evacuate a building.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, also as a firefighter, I was trained how to search a room, search a flat, search a corridor, which is the bottom level of your evacuation. If you're it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to do, and it's very difficult to organise. And I've always had in the back of my mind about this. I can't tell you whether it's true or not. I thought that evacuation was going to be addressed, and I thought it was going to be addressed in the search and rescue policy. Now, I may be wrong. This may not be the truth, but that is my recollection, that because it fits beautifully in search and rescue, for me anyway, evacuation. So I thought that someone was looking at it. Whether I'm completely mistaken or whether for other reasons that didn't happen, that's where I thought that was going to go.
And just picking up on that, when you say that you thought that it was going to be addressed in the search and rescue policy, do you know when you thought that? Was that when you were working on the draft policy 633?
Well, it would have been after Lacanau.
I see. Thank you. So we're coming up to 11:15, and I think that's a convenient.
Is that a convenient point from your point of view?
Point for everyone else, yes.
All right, thank you. I wonder if we could just, before we have our break, which we're going to take in just a moment, Mr. Utting, I wonder if we could just go back for a moment to one of the documents we looked at earlier, because I'm not sure that I really understood what Mr. Utting was telling. If you want some water, please help yourself. I think the document was LFB 00001256/14. It's the draft PN 633 that was circulated to the heads of service.
I think, sir, that may be the final version that's up there, but I'll find you the reference.
Well, we've got the one that I just wanted to check up on. I think it's on the screen now, Mr.
Yes.
And I think that Council asked you whether you knew how 747 little b got into the draft. And my note suggests that you said you couldn't recall how it had got in there. First of all, did I understand you correctly?
Oh, it will have got in there because of 3.2.
Yes, but what I just wanted to clarify with you is this, that the impression I'm getting from your evidence is that you were the master draftsman as far as 633 is concerned. It was your fingers on the keyboard, if I can put it like that. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
Right. And you remained the master draftsman throughout all the different versions of 633?
I didn't finish it, sir.
Ah, well, that might explain, because if I can explain the reason for my question, it seemed to me a little surprising that if you were the master draftsman with your fingers on the keyboard, you couldn't remember how something like 747 little b got into the text.
Do you mean the process of how it got into the text, or how it physically got put in. I'm not sure.
Well, what it was that stimulated you to put it in, and I was surprised that you couldn't remember, apparently, making that amendment or the reason for it.
So I spent 6 years writing policy. I'm really sorry.
No, it's all right.
If you get a list of the London Fire Brigade policies, I will quite happily mark the ones I wrote from scratch and the ones that I reviewed at least once. So and so just the passing of time and not having been in the loop for the last 6 years. Mea culpa, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I just wanted to make sure I'd understood it correctly. So should we understand that the probability is that you added the text to the document?
Yes.
But you can't remember what was the immediate reason for doing so?
That's correct.
All right. Well, that does clarify my understanding. Thank you very much. All right. Do you want to ask any questions arising out of that particular?
No, thank you, sir, not at this moment.
Thank you. In that case, Mr. Utting, we'll have our morning break now. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And as with everyone else, I have to ask you, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it over the break.
I will not, sir.
Thank you very much. Right, would you like to go to the usher then, please? Thank you. Right, thank you very much. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask Mr. Utting to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Utting, ready
Sir.
to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Curtin.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Utting, before the break, I was asking you about evacuation, and you said, I think I've got this right, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you thought that evacuation would be addressed in the search and rescue policy. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes.
And do you know if there was any review of the search and rescue policy carried out after the Lakanal house fire?
I don't know that, no.
Do you know who would have been responsible for carrying out any such review of the search and rescue policy?
No, I would assume breathing apparatus. Makes sense.
Thank you. And we were also looking at Peter Cowup's email to you and Philip Morton of the 3rd of August 2013, and I'd just like to get that back on the screen, please, just as a reminder. That's LFB 000 84467. Thank you. And we were looking in particular at Peter Cowup's first point in his recollection of what was discussed at his meeting with officials from the Department for Communities and Local Government. And that was making more explicit the point that the advice given to occupants in residential high-rise buildings to stay put and keep doors and windows closed, provided their dwelling is not affected by the fire, heat or smoke, may need to change. And my question to you arising out of that is whether you were aware at the time that the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government had made an explicit commitment to the Lakanal coroner that the new generic risk assessment 3.2 would include advice to incident commanders to inform decisions on evacuation should it become clear that the stay put policy, or the stay put principle, I should say, is no longer tenable.
Is that Mr. Pickles? Is that?
That's correct, yes.
No.
No. For completeness, I'd like to ask you to look at the letter in which that commitment is set out, and this is at HOM 000 47743, please. Thank you. And you can see there, the top right-hand corner, that's coming from Eric Pickles, and it's going to Her Honour Francis Kirkham, who's the Lakanal coroner, you'll remember. Is that letter familiar to you?
No.
And could I ask you, please, to look at the second page and the third paragraph, which reads, on your other recommendations, I can confirm that my department's generic risk assessment guidance on high-rise firefighting is under review at present and will be informed by all of the recommendations you have made in your Rule 43 recommendations. It will also include advice to incident commanders to inform decisions on evacuation should it become clear during an incident that the stay put principle is no longer tenable. Now, you've said that you were not aware that that explicit commitment had been made by the Secretary of State. Do you recall if you were aware in general terms that the department were particularly concerned that GRA 3.2 should include that specific advice, i.e. in relation to reversing stay put advice?
By the department you mean DCLG?
Yes, absolutely.
No.
And does it follow then that you were similarly not aware at the time that you were working on the draft 633 that DCLG had raised concerns with Peter Cowup or indeed anyone else that that commitment was not being met by the terms of the draft GRA 3.2?
I don't recall that, no.
Now, the final version of GRA 3.2 was eventually published in February 2014. And I'd like to take you to a number of passages in that final version, please, because I would like to ask you how those impacted on your ongoing review of Policy 633. So if we could look, please, at LFB 001255, and that's the published version of GRA 3.2 there. And if we could look, first of all, please, at page 19. And just to orientate you, this is in the planning section of the GRA. And at the top of that page, we can see the text, contingency plans for particular premises should cover. Can you see that?
Yes.
And I'll just read the first two bullet points. Fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues. An operational evacuation plan being required in the event the stay put policy becomes untenable. Could you explain in basic terms what you understand a contingency plan to be?
As soon as you say the word contingency plan, I'm taken to Op Note 300. Operational Note 300s. There used to be a raft of them that were places like Southwark Cathedral might have been one. The Houses of Parliament may well have been one. I mean, do they just mean a plan?
Well, that's rather my question. Did you have an understanding, do you remember, when you were looking at this as part of your review of Policy 633, as to what was meant?
I don't recall questioning it at the time. No, I'd probably have taken the word contingency away in my head just because a contingency plan is Op Note 300.
Do you remember considering those provisions specifically of the GRA 3.2?
It's hard to remember. What I would say is that if they're transferred from the GRA 3.2 into 633, then yes. If they're not, then no.
Sorry, you mean if provisions are replicated from GRA 3.2 into Policy 633, it must mean that you considered them at the time. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I mean, the line fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, the potential for multiple rescues,
yes.
that feels like a straight lift, if you like, from 633.
Yes. Well, perhaps if we go to Policy 633 in that case, because it would be very helpful to see how you carry through these provisions into 633. So I'm going to ask the Documents Manager, please, if we could keep that page 19 of GRA 3.2 on the screen, please. And if we could have, again, on the other side of the screen, the published version of Policy 633, and it's page 7 of that document. So the reference for that is LFB 001256/7. Thank you. And you'll see there, Mr. Utting, that section 4 on page 7 is the planning section in Policy 633. And if we look at paragraph 4.8, and if we go down a little bit just so we can see the first, thank you, the first subparagraph A, the tactics and resources required to mount safe rescue and firefighting operations should be assessed, practiced and confirmed where necessary for the building concerned. This may include the following considerations. A, planning for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues. So, as you say, that does indeed replicate precisely the first bullet point in GRA 3.2 that we've just been looking at. Can you see that? You
yes.
agree with that, presumably?
Yeah.
And then if we look at the second bullet point in GRA 3.2, so that's an operational evacuation plan being required in the event the stay put policy becomes untenable, there is no reference to that, at least in that section of Policy 633 that we're looking at. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Do you recall whether that was a conscious decision to not replicate the second bullet point in 633?
No.
Do you know if that's likely to have been an oversight, or is it just that you don't remember?
I can't imagine why we would have taken it out deliberately. It's again, the words are familiar to me.
Thank you. Can I now ask you, please, to look at the competence and training section of GRA 3?
Right, before we leave these two documents, if you cast your eye down 4.8, B, C, D, E, and so on, a lot of them seem to reflect, in some cases almost word for word, the bullet points in the GRA. The only one that they run out in the end, but the one that seems to be missing is the one to which Council's just drawn your attention. It seems a little surprising, doesn't it, that that is the one that's missing.
Has it been put in evacuation?
Well, I don't know. I can't answer that question. Perhaps you can't either. But
Well, not off the top of my head, but if it's been taken from planning, the only other place I would
you think it might become...
potentially see it may come up in evacuation.
All right, well, we'll have a look. Thank you.
If it would be helpful, Mr. Utting, we can look at the evacuation section of 633. Would that be helpful?
Yes, that would be helpful.
If we could perhaps, if I could ask the Documents Director, please, to go to page 1 of 633, so the document on the right-hand side, please, which has the contents page. And if we could go to... If we could try page 7, I think. Sorry, that's the section that we were just
Section
looking
7.
at, isn't it? 14, please. Thank you. It's on the screen. Thank you very much.
So are you wanting me to point out?
Is there any specific provision in that section that you consider implements that bullet point in GRA 3.2 that we were just looking at? And it's page 19 of GRA 3.2, please. I think it's at the top of the page. Thank you, yes.
Oh, well, so you're not taking it may be necessary to undertake a partial or full evacuation in a residential building where a stay put policy is normally in place?
Well, I mean, that would be my question to you. Would you say that that is the equivalent, as it were, of that bullet point in GRA 3.2?
To undertake a partial or full evacuation. For me, it's saying the same thing, but the other way round.
I see.
Well, one is directed to planning, isn't it?
Yes.
And the other is directed to operational matters.
Well, I mean, all operational matters would need some sort of a plan.
Well, yes, but the point I was really seeking to make was that in the GRA, the passages that we were looking at are directed to plans that you make before the incident occurs, whereas the section in 633 on evacuation is really more directed to the practical aspects.
Yes, so if you're going to make a plan beforehand, you would need an example of that would be your 72D visits.
Yeah.
So within your 72D visits, I think there's a list about planning for evacuation, and also you've got the parent document 800. So this could be, I've done a cut and paste and missed I find that unlikely, and or excuse me, we've put it for some reason, and again this could be, I know it might be not be the right time because it sounds ridiculous, trying to condense the policy. If we thought that doesn't sound right to me, it looks like error rather than anything else, rather than we think it's reasonable enough to put it in another policy. So I'd probably potentially have to say that could be an error.
Thank you.
Well, sorry to interrupt your flow, but
Thank you, sir. I'm now going to ask you if we could stick with those two documents on the screen, please, and if I could ask you to look at page 21, please, of the GRA 3.2. So that's the document on the left-hand side, please. And this is within the competence and training section of GRA 3.2. And we can see the final paragraph, or it's a line again at the bottom of the page, and it's setting out guidance on training for high-rise incidents. And it says, training which will cover high-rise incidents must include, and then if we go over to page 22, thank you, and it's the 8th bullet point down, which says evacuation and casualty removal tactics. Do you see that paragraph there? Incident commanders should understand when a partial or full evacuation strategy might become necessary in a residential building where a stay-put policy is normally in place. And then if we could look over the page, we've already got page 14 of Policy 633 up, which sets out the evacuation section and the fire survival guidance section. And would you agree that there is no references there in Policy 633 to incident commanders being trained to understand when a partial or full evacuation strategy might be necessary in a residential building where a stay-put policy is normally in place?
Sorry, there's no specific reference in which part of 633?
Well, in any part of 633. Right. But we're on page 14 because I'm assuming that's where you would expect it to be set out, if anywhere, because that's the evacuation section.
Yes, I mean, the nearest you get is B, but that doesn't talk about planning to do it. But again, I suppose part of the planning would be the resources you need to do it. But no, it's not as specific as it's worded in GRA, definitely not.
And do you recall whether you specifically considered that direction in GRA 3.2 in relation to training of incident commanders?
Training for me is training rather than policy. So I would have expected, in order to get an incident commander to understand something, you've got to give them the knowledge and skills to give you the understanding to do that. So that's training. That would be very difficult for me in a policy because it would be very difficult to evaluate.
I see. So it's your evidence that it's likely, would I be right in summarising, that specific reference to the training of incident commanders in policy in national guidance GRA 3.2 does not feature in policy 633 because it's not appropriate for training matters to be included in operational policies. Is that right?
My view, and don't get me wrong, I've wrote some policies that were training documents. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I was always uncomfortable with doing that because I believe and still do that policies should not be about training, for me. Policies should be about giving you the knowledge, and then what we'll try and do is train the skills and maybe the understanding as well into people. I was always and it just made, and plus it just made them even longer than they were to start with. And I know what it's like being a watch manager on a busy fire station, and you're asked to, say, do some training, and sometimes, especially in my day, that training was read the policy. Yeah, they're not a great read. Yeah, and if you know your audience, you would, I think, instinctively, as a watch officer, give your people what you think they needed to know. And again, from my own personal experience, you would go, right, okay, where in this policy, where do I need to start? Okay. Let's say we'll start planning, because we do 72Ds. Let's start at planning. Let's get that out of the way. But really, what the risk is, right? Well, whatever. The bells go down. Right, en route. We'll do that bit and then where do we plug in? What do we got to do? That's it. Great, we know.
Can I just ask you to perhaps, if by way of recap, if we just look back at those provisions that we were just looking at in the GRA 3.2. So if we could go back onto page 21, please, of GRA 3.2, which is the document on the left. And again, we saw at the bottom, training which will cover high-rise incidents must include, and if we can go over the page again, please, and just looking at the same paragraph there, the 8th bullet point down, evacuation and casualty removal tactics. Incident commanders should understand when a partial or full evacuation strategy might become necessary in a residential building where a stay-put policy is normally in place. Would you agree that is a very clear direction about incident command training?
It's clear and it's very difficult.
Can you explain how you would expect the LFB to pick up on that direction in GRA 3.2 if that was not, if the high-rise firefighting policy was not the right place for it, which it may well not have been? How else would the LFB go about acting on that direction in GRA 3.2?
Train them.
And so could you explain in brief terms what you would expect to happen? Who would be responsible for identifying that training requirement that's set out in GRA 3.2?
I wrote the TCAP.
For the high-rise firefighting policy, that is?
633, yes, absolutely.
Yes, which we're going to come on to.
Yeah.
So does that mean that the right place for that particular direction about incident command training to be picked up on would be the TCAP for policy 633?
I'm not suggesting it would necessarily be the right place. It would definitely, there would be some reference to evacuation in the TCAP.
I see.
I mean, as I recall, the TCAP, it's a long list of explain.
Yes,
this.
we will come on to it in due course, so don't worry, you'll have a chance to address the panel on that as well.
I mean, I suppose that doesn't mean that it could have been in 633. I just think it would have been. Would anyone have read it?
Could I ask you? I'm just going to ask you one more question on this, Mr. Utting. Could I ask you to look again at 633, please? So on the right-hand side of the screen, and paragraph 7.46, which, as we've seen, reads, it may be necessary to undertake a partial or full evacuation in a residential building where a stay-put policy is normally in place. Do you recall whether you considered the impact of that provision on existing LFB training? Do you remember if you considered whether that direction there was catered for in existing LFB training?
I don't recall it being a training package, if that's what you mean by your question.
My question was more in your own mind, whether you gave consideration to that. Do you remember thinking about what existing LFB incident command policy was, what it consisted of, in light of what's being set out there in paragraph 7.46, which is that it may be necessary to undertake an evacuation in a building with a stay put policy?
Well, you've got there was policy on office evacuation.
Yes.
But there was never any policy that I can recall about fully evacuating or a residential block of flats.
Yes, and that's consistent with what we understand from the witness statement of Commissioner Andy Rowe.
No, if there, because again, I suppose that again a lot of the time, training is driven by policy. So if there's no policy, there's not likely to be training on something.
Yes.
Broadly speaking.
But I suppose that we are looking at a policy here, aren't we?
Yes.
And there is a provision that says that it may be necessary to undertake a partial or full evacuation.
Yes.
In a residential building where a stay put policy is normally in place.
Yes.
And my question is just very simply whether you recall giving that particular provision consideration at the time that you were working on the draft 633 in terms of how it impacted on incident command policy.
I can't, no.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to another subtopic, and this is the consultation process for 633 and the end of that, the final stages of that. And if I could ask you to look back at your witness statement, please, which is at LFB 0018918/18 and paragraph 75. And you state there that on the 8th of January 2014, you shared the then latest version of Policy 633 with Tom Goodall and Donna Perry-Harkin for distribution to the Operational Sounding Board for review. And just to be clear, we've heard some evidence from Peter Cowart on the Operational Sounding Board, but just to recap on that was a part of the consultation process for policy development, is that right?
Yes.
And in broad terms, the purpose of that stage is to ensure that the development of policies takes into account the views and experience of those who will be following operational policy on the ground. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yes. And as a reminder, we looked at the previous stage of the policy consultation, which was the circulation of the draft to the heads of service,
Yes.
which was July 2013. And now we're looking at January 2014 for the Operational Sounding Board review. Do you know if there was a particular reason for that time lag between July 2013 and January 2014?
No, I'm sort of slightly. You're saying that it went to OSB after heads of service.
It appears to be that way, yes.
That doesn't sound like the right way around to me. However, I'm trying to think of any circumstances around the time. There might have been a delay, and Peter was using the delay, I was using the delay to gather more feedback.
I see.
I can't recall what that delay would have been.
Okay. Were you involved in considering any of the feedback that was received as part of the Operational Sounding Board, part of the consultation?
I'd be surprised if I wasn't. Yes, I must have been.
There's just one item of feedback that I'd like to ask you about fairly briefly, please, Mr. Utting.
Yes.
And this was recorded in a spreadsheet that's been exhibited to Peter Cowart's witness statement to the inquiry. And the spreadsheet is at LFB 00102-537. And I'm going to ask the documents manager to please download that spreadsheet, so it may take a couple of moments. Thank you. And if we could look, please, at line 46. Thank you. Can you see that one, Mr. Utting? It's recorded as feedback from John Button. He's in the second column.
Seen, yes.
Yeah, and in column E, his feedback was recorded as, in general, I believe a subject matter as important as high-rise firefighting deserves a separate policy for commercial and residential. I find the current and draft policy leaves a lot of questions unanswered, especially concerning reconnaissance and where to set into if fire spreads to another floor. It's good for identifying hazards, but does not give guidance on how to deal with them. It's good for dealing with a fully developed fire contained to one compartment/flat without savable life involved. However, it is flawed for a small fire due to delayed attack leading to fire growth. It's also flawed if a fire spreads beyond compartment and floor without the aid of a controlled dividing breach. Has this policy been tested practically? I'm in the process of organising a combined high-rise exercise. If you would like to utilise this exercise to check the robustness of the policy, I'd be happy to accommodate. And the response to that feedback is set out in columns F and G immediately next to that. And we can see in column F there is the word reg, which is probably short for rejected, is that right?
Yes.
And column G gives some more substantive feedback, which is the national GRA does not distinguish between commercial and residential. Having two policies would add confusion. Also, which would you use at a multi-use building? We're working on a policy called operational risk assessment. It's like the current DRA policy. Would that be dynamic risk assessment?
Yes.
Except it allows for operational discretion whereby you deal with a small incident as you described. Breachings are being looked into. Do you know whose comments in response those were in that column G?
There'll probably be me and another. But I couldn't tell you who that other person might be.
Sure. Do you remember considering the feedback from John Button at the time?
I don't remember it, no.
No. Would you agree with the point that he makes about the policy identifying hazards but not giving guidance on how to deal with those hazards?
To a certain extent. I mean, it's not a training document. It's a policy document.
Yes.
It is heavy on hazards,
Yes.
and that's the format of policy writing that had been agreed.
Would you agree that the point that he is making arguably applies to the way that the policy addresses the issue of evacuation of a residential building with a stay put policy? In other words, the policy identifies the potential need for that to happen, but it does not set out any explicit guidance on how an incident commander might go about managing that. Would you agree with that?
I don't. I think the way I read it, it's more about dealing with fires rather than evacuation. Unless I'm missing something.
Yes,
obvious.
it's correct that it's not specifically about evacuation, but I suppose my question was whether you agreed that is a criticism that could be made of the policy insofar as it deals with evacuation, because the potential need for evacuation is there, but there is no guidance specifically on how one might go about carrying that out.
No, and I go back to my previous point that's extremely difficult
Yes.
to write down
Yes.
in a document.
Yes.
And I would always go back to whatever I wrote down, the first time you use it, it won't be the right way to do it.
Yes.
That's why I was rather more interested in trying to empower people rather than tell them exactly what to do, because if you keep reinforcing that behaviour with people,
Yes.
you will then get those behaviours that you wish, in which they will want to be told what to do.
And also picking up on something that you said earlier, which was that actually the place for that was training rather than policy. Is that another reason why you would say in this context?
Well, at least within a training scenario, I can give you an example of a fire, I can give you an example of a building, we can discuss, we can talk, we can practice, we can throw in the, oh dear, it's gone wrong, yeah? But to try and get all those factors in a policy, I'll admit, would be beyond me.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask you, Mr. Utting, about the next stage of the consultation process. So we know that the draft policy was eventually submitted to the Brigade's Joint Council for Health and Safety at Work in February 2015.
Committee?
Committee, yes. Is that right? Rather than council, sorry, I said council.
I have made the error myself, but I think for accuracy it is. I know I've made the mistake because I can show you a mistake where I've done it. But for accuracy, it's committee.
That's very helpful, thank you. If I could ask you to look back at your witness statement, please,
yes.
Which is at LFB 00118 918/20. And it's paragraph 85. And you say here, on the 19th of February 2015, I shared the then reviewed and updated PN 633 with its accompanying risk assessment, TCAP, sustainability impact assessment and equalities impact assessment for BJC HSW consultation with the BJC HSW administration group, Dominic Johnson and Dermot Green. And again, would it be fair to observe that there has been apparently some delay in between the previous stage of the consultation process? So we've just looked at the review by the Operational Sounding Board, which was January 2014. And now here we have you sharing the reviewed and updated policy with BJC HSW in February 2015. Is that kind of delay normal for development of policies of this nature?
No.
Do you know if there was a particular reason for it?
Yes.
Could you tell us what the reason was?
That was because we used our risk assessment to increase the PDA for a high-rise fire from 3 pumping appliances to 4 pumping appliances. That's the bottom line.
So there were ongoing discussions about that increased attendance, so essentially a greater number of appliances to attend
Yes.
high-rise fires.
I put in the risk assessment. When you score a risk assessment, you come up with a score. And if that score is in the red, you have to implement additional control measures. And we worked it that we were in the red. And so the control measure we chose, because of the rewrite of 633 and the roles that we were demanding effectively that personnel would carry out, I stress, without doing any sort of time and motion study, deliberately, we thought we could get our people an extra fire engine, increase the PDA at a time of where everything else is being knocked down.
Yes.
We thought we could do something really, really good.
Understood. Just focusing on the issue of time, though.
Yeah.
It's right, isn't it, that this is, by the time you are getting in touch with BJC HSW, February 2015, that's almost 2 years after your initial instruction to start work on the review of Policy 633, which was April 2013. Do you remember if at the time you were concerned by that delay or time lag, if I can put it more neutrally?
I wasn't concerned because I was never going to sign off 633. Bluntly, the advantage of it not being published was that, and to be fair, we couldn't have published it without the extra fire engine because we couldn't have met our own risk assessment. We'd come up with the control measure. So that the delay was, we then had to write an ODCB report,
Yes.
explaining what we wanted, and then we had to turn that into a CMB report. And I think, to be fair to CMB, they saw the report in February and they went yes in February. So.
And just to be clear on what you've said there, Mr. Utting, when you said I was never going to sign off 633, do you mean there that it was just in terms of whose ultimate responsibility it was, that didn't fall to you? That's
what I meant. But I suppose strictly, well, and in policy terms, if I can't, if my risk assessment's in the red,
yes,
you can't. I can't progress. I've got to come up with control measures.
Thank you.
I've got to bring the score back down.
Now, you said in that paragraph of your statement that we've still got on the screen there that one of the documents that you sent to the BJC HSW was the TCAP for 633, and we've touched on this earlier already today. Could I ask you to look at that TCAP form, please? And it's at LFB 000 51648. Thank you. And we can see that the title, High-Rise Firefighting, is on page 2. And the inquiry's heard a lot about the internal processes within the brigade for training development. So just very briefly, as a reminder, TCAP is the formal request that a department within the LFB makes for training to be either developed from scratch or amended. Is that correct?
Yes.
The TCAP form is the beginning of the process.
It is.
And as was addressed with Mr. Cowup yesterday, you were forwarding the TCAP form to the BJC HSW at this stage, but you would agree, presumably, that did not in itself formally start the TCAP process. That was not the trigger for the development of policy, sending it to BJC HSW.
Definitely not, no.
No, it would need to go to the training department for that, is that right?
Absolutely.
Do you know if the form was ever in fact submitted to the training department?
No.
You don't know?
No.
Could we look, please, at page 5 of the TCAP? And you're listed as the author.
Yeah.
That means you wrote the TCAP, presumably?
Yes.
And the date given there is the same date that you sent the documents to the BJC HSW, so the 19th of Feb 2015. Does that mean that was the date that you drafted the TCAP, do you think?
It could have been.
Do you recall, and this is picking up on questions that I've asked you earlier today, to what extent was it on your mind that the new policy 633 had introduced the need for incident commanders to be able to carry out an evacuation of a building with a stay-put policy? Do you remember if that was on your mind at the time when you drafted the TCAP?
I don't think that would have been on my mind, no.
And just going back to the gap that we referred to earlier about the gap in LFB training and the lack of training on how to carry out evacuation, would it follow that similarly was not on your mind when you drafted the TCAP?
That was not on my mind, no, not that I can recall.
And can you explain in general terms whether you in fact thought that there were any changes to LFB high-rise training or incident command training or indeed any other kind of training arising out of the new policy 633?
Massive.
Could you would it be possible to give us a broad overview of the topics of training that you thought were identified by the new policy?
Well, hopefully there'll be a long list.
I see. So we'll
Of objectives and just the how can I put it? The standard operating procedure had changed. Not massively, but we were formally laying out roles. Part of the reason we got the fire engine was because we wanted people to go and do a full 360 of the building, have a crew manager, that have safety officers, and that they were the reasons we managed to get the extra fire engine. So within that, you've then got to think, well, I've got to, okay, right, I might need a firefighter to be a safety officer. Right, okay, do we need to get some sort of qualification to do that, the training to do that, the sign-off, the evaluation, etc., etc. So for me, that the training implication of 633, bearing in mind its birth, where it's come from, as a training commitment for me, and just the practicality and the difficulty of training on high rise. I mean, Pete and I went up to West Midlands and they built a lovely high rise training facility. We went there to have a look at it. You would need something like that to practically give people effective training. You're talking about we've got to throw fire at them, we've got to throw smoke at them, we've got to go people coming down the stairs, people not behaving, which, to be fair, in some exercises we did do at Mawson, but not very widely.
Let's have a look through the policy and I'll see if I can ask some more specific questions of you about the training. So if we could go to page 10, please. And I think this is probably the section of the TCAP that you were referring to a moment ago. And we can see there in box 4.1, what do you want this training to achieve? And then in italics, what do staff need to be able to do following completion of this training? And would I be right in saying that it was you who drafted the text that's in that box there?
Those are definitely my words.
Thank you. And just for the benefit of the transcript, I'll read that out. Staff will be able to explain the hazards associated with building height, layout and design, explain the hazards associated with fire behaviour and development, explain the hazards associated with firefighting and rescue operations, describe the firefighting facilities and fixed installations available, explain the need for planning, describe the process of securing water supplies, describe the process of securing and using a firefighting lift, explain the process of establishing a bridgehead and fire sector, list the items of equipment to be taken to a bridgehead, explain the safe systems of work that need to be in place in order to be able to send high-rise implemented message, describe control measures when committing crews, undertaking search and rescue, evacuation, fire survival guidance and ventilation, list the considerations when undertaking a 7.2D visit, demonstrate where possible applying high-rise procedure. Would it be fair to observe about that text that we've just looked at that there is nothing explicitly there to indicate that incident commanders should be able to understand when and how to evacuate a building with a stay-put policy? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Can you help us with the reference to evacuation in the, I think it's the third, third point from the bottom. So describe control measures when committing crews, undertaking search and rescue, evacuation, fire survival guidance and ventilation. Do you know what you would have been intending to encompass when you referred to evacuation in that context?
I think to be... You can see how those this list of objectives has been compiled. It's been done by starting at the top of the policy and working your way all the way through. It's not rocketry to establish what the objectives should be. So, if within evacuation there's nothing about stay put, it's unlikely, but possible that whoever started putting the training together might miss it. And at the end of the policy, and it's not explicit, but there is a long list of documents that does include the GRA.
Yes.
And for me, if I was a trainer and I was asked to put together a training package
Yes.
around this subject, I've got a really nice starting point. Not exclusive, but that's going to get me rolling, simply because that's where the people who wrote the policy, well, that's where their heads were.
In the sense of when you say you've got a really nice starting point, in the sense of GRA 3.2 being your starting point?
No, as within all your long list of. So if you're going to start doing a training presentation about high-rise firefighting, you might start off by going basic introduction, high-rise fire, Lacanal, GRA. This is what a GRA is. Review led to this.
But was that not the purpose of this box here? So box 4.1?
No, that's not the purpose of that. This is to give the Babcock a steer early on what I thought they would need to consider to put together the training package.
So if we think back to that direction about incident command training that was in GRA 3.2 that we looked at earlier, so that direction that training should cover incident commanders being able to understand when a partial and full evacuation strategy might become necessary in a residential building where a stay-put policy is normally in place. So that clear direction that was in GRA 3.2
hasn't made it.
It's not explicit in box 4.1, and what I'm trying to understand is whether it's your evidence that that's not the purpose of box 4.1, and actually that direction in 3.2 ought to have been picked up on because it was referred to as a reference in policy 633. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think I would have. I think that's coincidence. I don't think that's. Honestly, that was my purpose in doing that.
Your purpose in doing what? Sorry.
In trying to get the bit about the training part of the GRA into this.
Yes.
So I'm not 100% sure how, unless the training department were all over the GRA, which I'd have thought would have been unlikely, how they would have got that specific instruction into training.
Yes. So if I can put it another way, whose responsibility would it have been to be, as you put it, all over GRA?
That would have been ours.
As the department responsible for putting together the TCAP?
Well, and by definition, the GRA, the policy, and then the TCAP, which drives the training. I mean, the thing about this TCAP is it's if you like, is its first evolution. There's the TCAP process was notoriously difficult, and I know that from experience. I used to write TCAPs because I wrote operational news and because of other things, and you would have this, and then you would get together,
and there would be discussions with.
Yes, I mean this is not the complete article in
No.
my mind of what a TCAP should look like.
Can I ask you then, Mr. Utting, do you know if those discussions and subsequent meetings around this TCAP did actually take place?
Well, I'm pretty confident that there are emails between myself and Damien, who worked in the TCAP, unless I'm thinking about a completely different TCAP, and again, I dealt with a lot.
Well, the reason, to be clear, the reason I ask is because the inquiry hasn't been able to identify any notes of any meetings or any associated documents arising out of this TCAP, or indeed any other versions of this TCAP that refine its contents in any way.
So you're telling me that there was no training?
I'm asking you whether you had any knowledge of or any involvement in any subsequent parts of the process after this TCAP was initiated.
No.
And who would have been involved in that process from the LFB?
Well, everything was left with Jim, because he chaired BJ's. Well, partly he was my boss, and he was physically at BJ's, chairing it.
Would you agree that direction about training that we looked at in GRA 3.2 a moment ago, so the direction that incident commanders should understand when a partial and full evacuation strategy might become necessary in a building with a stay-put policy, would you agree that direction about training ought to have been picked up on in this TCAP form?
Yes, it may not have been at this stage, if that makes sense, because as soon as you start doing a TCAP, you then, the process is you would then start talking to people, and you would bring together groups. You would have subject matter experts from Babcock,
yes,
and so on. So it's not just you gave them a bit of paper, they went away, thought about this is what we think that they mean.
Understood. I'm just conscious, Mr. Utting, that I can't ask you to give evidence, of course, about anything that you weren't involved in. And if you weren't involved in any of those subsequent discussions, presumably you can't tell us about whether that direction about training was considered at that stage.
No, I mean,
right?
I'm gone in a couple of months. And to be fair, the truth about me writing this document was I did it as a favour for Jim. I wasn't working. I'd given everything away, moved chairs, not far, but I'd moved chairs, and just because of my relationship with Jim, I think he asked me to put a TCAP together, and within a day he's got a TCAP. Whether he needed it in a day, I don't know.
Mr. Utting, it would help me to understand this. Can you recall now why that particular provision for training incident commanders to be aware of the potential need for evacuation did not find its way into this TCAP at this stage?
No, sir. I can't recall why there would be a deliberate omission, unless we thought that if you're going to start talking about fire survival guidance and you're going to start training people on fire survival guidance and high-rise policy, that by its nature that would be one of the situations that you would consider.
But you can't remember a discussion with anyone of that kind, or even turning that over in your own mind?
No, this wasn't discussed with anyone. I was asked to put a TCAP together on the 19th of February, and came up with that. Is that what you want? Because it's its nascence, if you like, and then from there, hopefully, someone will pick it up and run with it. And again, I have a recollection of, I think before doing this, of speaking to training and development, where I was asking for a favour of, would you look at this now? I know it's not got through BJ's because they've been burned before, Babcock, about doing a lot of work, goes to BJ's, gone. So I had a pretty good, because I'd worked with them so a lot. I had pretty good relations with them, so I could go along. They knew me, they trusted me, and I could give them the truth and say, this is going to go, this is going to run, this is going to be big. Yeah, and I think there was just a slight negotiation from them, is can we bring something else into it and we'll start working on it. And I thought, that'll do for me.
Thank you. Can I ask you now to look at one of the other documents that was attached to your email to BJC HSW, and that's the risk assessment for policy 633.
Yeah.
And that's at LFB 000 30368. Thank you. And would it be correct to say that the purpose of a risk assessment is to inform the content of a policy?
Absolutely, yes.
And do you recall when you put together the risk assessment for policy 633? If it helps, if we look at page 2.
There should be a date.
Yes, so it's dated the 19th of Feb 2015, so the same date as your email to BJC HSW.
That won't have all have been done on the same day.
No. Do you know if it would have been done at a much earlier stage, for example, right at the beginning of your work on, on amending?
You start with a risk assessment.
I see. So
we're back to the birth again. That's the first thing that you do, because you need to work out A, whether you need the policy
yes.
in the first place, and B, what are the hazards, risks, control measures involved with that process, whatever it may be.
So do you recall in that case, and not necessarily a specific date, but do you think that you started work on this risk assessment policy at an earlier stage, so as one of the first items of work that you carried out in relation to your review of 633?
Definitely. I mean, I think that's explicit in my statement, where we took the list of hazards from the GRA.
Yes.
And then we had 32 and we came up with 38. And that's the risk assessment I'm talking about, that went to CMB and
I see.
ODCB.
I see.
Got us the fire engine.
I see. There are a number of ways in which this risk assessment does not reflect the final version of policy 633.
No, and that will be because what very rarely happens when you get to the end of a process that's however many years long, your completer finisher at the end of this project, if you like, goes all the way back to the beginning and goes, right, that's what we wanted, that's what we've got. And there aren't many completer finishers in the London Fire Brigade.
So is it likely to be the case then that the reason why that risk assessment doesn't reflect the final version of policy 633 in a number of respects is because it was actually drafted at an earlier stage and there were developments to the policy that didn't end up being reflected in the risk assessment?
That's highly likely, yes. Yes, because in my head, it's the risk assessment that drives the policy.
Yes.
So if it's in the risk assessment, it should be in the policy. If somehow something gets into the policy that's not in the risk assessment, it needs to be really needs to be back in the risk assessment somehow. But that's a process that has to be carried out. You know, our lovely flowchart process,
yes.
Yeah, it's not quite long enough.
So does it follow from what you're saying that you might expect to update a risk assessment at a later stage in the process?
Well, that risk assessment, in my mind, should have been looked at the day before this policy was published.
I see.
I mean, the times between the birth of that risk assessment and the policy coming out, we could have had different coloured fire engines in that time.
I'm just going to ask you some specific points about issues that aren't reflected in this risk assessment, because I'm conscious that I'm asking you questions in the abstract at the moment. So the first point that does not appear to be covered in the risk assessment is this potential need for incident commanders to undertake an evacuation in a building with a stay put principle is in place. Again, do you think that's likely to be explained by the fact that the risk assessment was drafted before those changes were made to the draft policy?
Yes.
And would that also apply to the fact that there is no reference in the risk assessment to the need to reevaluate advice being given to callers in a building, including the potential need to change stay put advice?
Yes, and also just on that point, that's something that would fit nicely into fire survival guidance as well. For me, there is quite often a link. So yes.
And finally, there is no reference in the risk assessment to the need to plan for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues, which was similarly referred to in the final version of the policy.
That does surprise me, that
yes.
one.
Can you think of any explanation why that might not appear in the risk assessment?
No. Again, from memory, it mentions fire spread between compartments?
I think there are passing references to compartmentation, but the specific risk or the specific need to plan for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues as a result of that fire spread is not referenced in the risk assessment.
Oh, well, that's disappointing.
Thank you. I'm going to now move on to the second part of the questions I'm going to be asking you. So this is in relation to policy 790. As we've referred to already, this was the LFB's policy on fire survival guidance calls, and it was developed directly as a result of the Lakanal House fire. Is that right?
Yes.
And just to be clear, I'm afraid this is going to involve going back in time, because as you've already touched on, you were working on the development of Policy 790 a number of years, actually, before your work on Draft Policy 633. Is that right?
2011.
Yes. Thank you. If I could ask you to look, please, at your witness statement, and the reference for that is LFB 0018918/3, please. And it's paragraph 7. And you say in the third sentence there, so halfway down in the paragraph, I was asked to take the lead on the drafting of the policy by AC Jim Knighton, who was in operational policy. I worked within incident management policy at the time. And that was in late 2010, is that right? I think that's what you say elsewhere in your statement. So actually just looking a little bit further down.
I believe so. Late 2010 we started. It was pretty much ready June, July 11 and didn't come out till the 23rd of February 12.
Thank you. And do you know why you were asked specifically to work on the creation of Policy 790? Did you have any particular experience with FSG calls or indeed communications with control?
No.
And can I ask you to look briefly at the LFB's control report, the Lakanal control report, which is the report that was put together before the Lakanal House inquest in November 2012, and which set out the learning points and actions taken by the Brigade arising out of the control room's role in the response to the Lakanal fire. And this is at HOM 0001124. Thank you. And you can see there it's entitled Role and Actions of the LFB Control, November 2012. And if we could look, please, at page 54. And again, to orientate you, this is within the summary of conclusions and recommendations section of the report. I should ask you first, Mr. Utting, apologies. Are you familiar with this report? Have you seen
No.
it before? No. Okay. So if I could ask you to look at paragraph 319, and this summarises one learning point that was identified. This reads, effective communication between control and incident command. There is evidence of information passing from control to the incident ground. This is on the day of the Lakanal House fire. And only one occasion when the details of a flat with people trapped were not passed in a timely way. Control supervisors regularly tried to obtain information about the progress with the incident, particularly in relation to callers being given FSG. In line with practice at the time, there was much less information being passed from the incident ground to control about the progress of firefighting and rescue efforts. It is not clear that if COs had been given information about progress, that it would have influenced the advice given to callers. Do you know what COs refers to there? Is that control operators?
CONOFs, control officers.
And would it be correct to say that Policy 790 was created specifically in order to address the issue that was identified there, that is the need for efficient and consistent flow of information between the incident ground and the control room?
Yes.
Now, you refer in paragraph 10 of your witness statement, if we could go back to that, please. The reference is LFB 00118-918/4. And you state there that you were instructed by AC Knighton to write an operational policy, as at that time there was no extant fire survival guidance operational policy. So just to be clear about what that means, it was your understanding, was it, that 790 was being developed specifically as an operational policy, so it was giving guidance and direction to operational crews on the incident ground rather than to control operators in the control room, is that right?
Yes, it was all about, because there hadn't been any previous guidance before, the people on the incident ground what to do.
Thank you. And if we can look at paragraph 8 of your statement again, and that's just over on the previous page, page 3, thank you. And if we could scroll down a little bit, and you say about halfway down there, as Brigade Control already had knowledge of fire survival guidance, and they are integral to responding to a fire survival guidance call, I worked closely with SOM, I think that's Senior Operations Manager, is that right?
Sounds right to me.
Stibbards throughout the drafting, consultation and approvals process to ensure that the policy we developed worked with control systems and processes. Once the idea was developed, I was responsible for the policy development, consultation and eventual publication, which took place in February 2012. Could you explain how you worked with SOM Joanne Stibbards as you went about creating the draft? For example, was there one of you that took the lead on the drafting, or did you split it up between the two of you?
I took the lead on the drafting, and Joanne, I think, weekly springs to mind that the control came to HQ in order to have a meeting, and regularly around those, I think, Wednesday mornings, we would catch up. And the general premise of it was that I would try and come up with a system of information recording and gathering, and then go, does this work? Is this achievable? Well, some of my ideas were not achievable at the time. And you know, the thing I starkly remember was me wanting to address the change of advice, because I'd been there and I knew what I knew around that, the outcome.
When you say you'd been there?
I was at Lakanal.
Right, so that was coming out of your direct experience of the Lakanal House fire?
3rd of July 2009.
Yes.
Do you want to carry on?
Absolutely.
So in the point about Joanne, I wanted our incident commanders to have the opportunity to change the advice, because it hadn't worked. and I came up with a form of words, and when that form of words was agreed, that's what went into the policy. But it was my original. I can't tell you what my original form of words were, but that paragraph was a negotiation driven largely by control, because they didn't. It wasn't universally popular. I don't think that, but that was one of the ones where I sort of I really want this, and that's how it happened.
Yes. And do you recall what Joanne Stibbard's views were when you first raised that need with her, that the need for a change in advice?
I think the impression I got, and I'm saying this is why it was difficult, is that control liked what they did. That was the impression, that they were very, very controlling, if you like. It is that nominative determinism. If you give an organisation that's what they want to do, they want to run you, and I think they were happy with how they worked, and it felt like any change, especially when you might ask them to make a decision, and I understand why, because they're not close, was sometimes not always well received, or there was the thought that it would not be well received.
I see.
I'm not trying to. That if you're asking for my feelings, that's what it felt like.
Understood. Yes, thank you. And there are a couple of emails that we'll come on to, actually, so they might prompt some further recollection. And just going back to the process, you say in that paragraph that we've just been looking at that you were also responsible for the consultation. Is that right?
Yes, I at this stage, I don't think there was any. The process you see later of an assistant commissioner's PA doing the sending out, I'm pretty confident I will have been doing all of that.
Yes, okay, thank you. And we'll come on to look at some of that. Just focusing on the point at which you were first asked to start working on Policy 790 by AC Knighton, and you've stated, as we see there in paragraph 10, and this is looking at the second sentence, that you... sorry, we're not on the right page. That's my fault. It's page 4. Thank you. And you say there in the second sentence that you've not been able to locate any documents which set out instructions or the proposed remit of the policy. Does that mean that you were given verbal instructions by Assistant Commissioner Knighton? Do you recall?
Yes, it will have been along the lines of write me a fire survival guidance policy.
Do you remember if you were given any more specific direction as to what that might look like, or what the objectives were?
No.
Do you recall if Joanne Stibbards was present for any sort of instruction or briefing that you were given?
She definitely wasn't.
Does it follow that there was no explicit discussion with AC Knighton, or indeed anyone else who was supervising you, about the issues that we've touched on earlier today that characterised the Lacknell House fire? So if we take one example, the unexpected failure of compartmentation and fire and smoke spread as a result of that. Do you remember if that was part of any of the discussions that you had?
Definitely not.
No. What about any reference to the need to address the scenario in which control were receiving calls from people in flats other than the fire flat, so in areas outside of, in other areas of the building aside from the flat of origin?
No, it was about, and you can see what it was about from the start of the policy. It defines what a fire survival guidance call is. That was what it was, because as I said, there was nothing before, and that's how the information was lost.
Yes. Do you recall if there was ever any discussion or consideration about creating a fire survival guidance policy in relation to high-rise incidents specifically?
No.
I'm going to ask you now about the consultation process that took place. And you refer, if we can look at paragraph 13 of your statement, please, and this is over the page on page 5. And you refer there, if we can look, it's actually the final sentence after that list of names, to an informal management consultation. And would it be correct to say, by way of summary, that this involved seeking feedback from a number of individuals in management positions in different areas and then proceeding to a formal management consultation?
Yes.
And have I understood it correctly that the informal management consultation was commenced in February 2011? Does that sound right?
It sounds right, yeah.
Yes. And then the formal management consultation that took place after that was commenced in April 2011, from what we can see. Does that sound right?
Sounds, it's moving, yeah.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask you to look at, please, the draft policy in the form that it was circulated for that consultation with management. And this is at LFB 000-83447. Thank you. And just to be clear, this was the draft version that was circulated for the informal management consultation in February 2011, but nothing turns on that. And could I ask you please to look at paragraph 6.6, which is on page 4. Thank you. And this states, in exceptional circumstances, an IC may consider informing control that their advice to FSG callers should be altered, i.e. to attempt to leave their property. And this is, I think, the passage that you were referring to a moment ago. This was the passage that came from you, if I can put it like that.
Yes.
Now, Joanne Smith, who was at the time Joanne Stibbards, has stated in her witness statement to the inquiry that it was she who recommended that this recommendation be given in the draft policy. Do you think that she might mean that it was a joint decision between the two of you, or is your recollection very much that it was you who was driving it?
Hand on heart, which is why I put it, and there's other people who know I've put it like that. I thought, because of my experience, because for me, because it went so badly wrong, I might be wrong. If Joanne says she did, then I'll apologise. But it's shifted my paradigm a bit, if you like. So, but if I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
Understood. I think I've probably got time to take you very quickly to an email exchange between you and Jim Knighton on the 4th of February 2011. So this was shortly before you commenced the informal management consultation on the draft policy. And this email is at LFB 000-49532. Thank you. And here, if we could look at the 4th and 5th paragraphs. This is you to Jim Knighton, and you're talking about following consultation with control. And then looking at the 4th and 5th paragraphs, you say there are concerns about the generic advice offered by control for occupiers to remain in their premises, which contradicts other community safety advice to leave premises in the event of fire. An option is to say that an incident commander could consider informing control of the advice to be offered to occupants, i.e. yes, stay in, or no, get out. And I think this might be the issue that you were referring to earlier about concerns, would I be right to put it that way, coming from control about the advice to give callers?
Yes, I mean, I suppose the email, it doesn't say who those concerns are from.
No, quite. And I was going to ask if you had any recollection.
No.
No. So it's just after 1 o'clock. And I think
Yes, is that a convenient point for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Right, well, I think it's time we stopped for a break for lunch, Mr. Utting. We'll come back, please, at 2 o'clock.
Yes.
And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
I will not, sir.
Thank you very much. You'd like to go to the ushers then, please. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock, please.
Thank you.